November 4th, 1979. US Embassy, Compound Tehran. Morning light spreads slowly across the streets of northern Tehran, but the quiet does not last long. By mid-morning, the sound of chanting crowds begins to echo against the embassy walls. Outside the tall iron gates of the American diplomatic compound, hundreds of Iranian students gather beneath banners and handwritten placards. Many wear headbands bearing revolutionary slogans. Some carry photographs of the exiled Shah. Others raise posters of a man who has become the defining figure of Iran's new political order, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Only months earlier, the Iranian Revolution had overthrown one of Washington's closest allies in the Middle East. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, had fled the country in January. In February, Khomeini returned triumphantly from exile in Paris, greeted by millions in the streets of Tehran. Now the Islamic Republic is still fragile, still forming its identity, and the anger toward the United States is growing. Inside the embassy compound, American diplomats watch the swelling crowd through office windows and security cameras. At first, demonstrations outside the embassy are not unusual. Throughout 1979, protests against the United States have become a common sight in Tehran. The embassy itself is widely viewed by revolutionaries as a symbol of American influence during the Shah's reign. But something feels different today. The chanting grows louder. Death to America. Death to the Shah. From the crowd emerges a group of university students who call themselves the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line. They carry bolt cutters, ropes, and ladders. Their goal is not merely to protest. Their goal is to seize the embassy. The students believe the United States is preparing another intervention in Iranian politics. The memory of 1953 still lingers in the revolutionary imagination. In that year, the CIA and Britain's MI6 helped orchestrate the overthrow of Iran's Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. The coup restored the Shah to power and reshaped Iran's political future for decades. To many young revolutionaries in Tehran, the American embassy represents the nerve center of that foreign interference. They call it the den of spies. Inside the compound, US Ambassador William H. Sullivan and his staff receive urgent reports from embassy security officers. Demonstrators are climbing the outer walls. Marine guards rush toward defensive positions, but they are vastly outnumbered. Within minutes, students begin scaling the gates. The iron barriers that separate diplomatic territory from the streets of Tehran begin to shake as ropes are thrown over the top. Some protesters climb onto each other's shoulders. Others push ladders against the walls. Then suddenly the first group drops down inside the compound. The embassy grounds erupt into chaos. American personnel scramble to destroy sensitive documents. Classified cables are fed into shredders. Diplomatic communications equipment is dismantled. Files are burned in emergency incinerators. For decades, U.S. embassies around the world have maintained strict procedures for exactly this scenario. But the crowd outside continues to grow. Soon, hundreds of militants pour into the compound. Marine guards, following strict rules of engagement, are ordered not to fire unless absolutely necessary. Washington fears that violence could ignite a wider confrontation with the new revolutionary government. Inside the Chancery building, diplomats barricade doors with desks and filing cabinets. But the students are determined. They move through the compound room by room, capturing American personnel one by one. By midday, dozens of diplomats, intelligence officers, and support staff have been taken hostage. Blindfolds are placed over their eyes. Hands are tied. Outside the embassy gates, jubilant crowds celebrate as news spreads across Tehran that the American embassy has fallen. Television cameras arrive quickly. Iranian state media begins broadcasting images of the captured compound. Students hold up seized documents and shout revolutionary slogans into microphones. Within hours, the story spreads across the world. In Washington, D.C., officials inside the White House Situation Room receive the first reports. President Jimmy Carter is briefed that the American embassy in Tehran has been overrun. More than 60 Americans are now prisoners inside the compound. At first, many U.S. officials believe the occupation will be temporary, perhaps a few hours, perhaps a day. But inside Tehran, the situation is already moving beyond the control of diplomats. The student leaders announce that the hostages will not be released until the United States returns the Shah to Iran to face trial. At that moment, the hostage crisis becomes more than a protest. It becomes a geopolitical confrontation. Ayatollah Khomeini himself soon signals approval of the embassy takeover, calling it a second revolution against American imperialism. And with those words, a standoff begins that will last far longer than anyone in Washington expects. Not hours, not days, but 444 days. The crisis will reshape American politics, redefine US-Iran relations, and become one of the most dramatic diplomatic confrontations of the 20th century. But on this November morning in Tehran, as blindfolded diplomats are marched through embassy corridors and revolutionary chants echo across the compound walls, no one yet knows how long this moment will last, or how deeply it will shake the United States. Across the Atlantic, inside the White House in Washington, the news arrives in fragments. Telephone lines buzz with urgency as diplomats, intelligence officers, and military advisors rush into the Situation Room. The early reports are confusing. Some suggest the demonstrators may soon leave. Others warn the embassy compound is now completely under militant control. President Jimmy Carter listens carefully as National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski and Secretary of State Cyrus Vance begin outlining the scale of the crisis. 66 Americans have been seized. The embassy has been occupied, and the Iranian government does not appear prepared to intervene. At first, Carter hopes the situation can still be resolved through diplomacy. The United States has not yet formally recognized the revolutionary government that replaced the Shah earlier in the year, but diplomatic channels remain open through Iran's provisional leadership. Prime Minister Mehdi Bazargan and Foreign Minister Ebrahim Yazdi had both attempted to maintain working relations with Washington. But events on the streets of Tehran are moving faster than the moderate leaders inside the government. Back in Tehran, the embassy compound has become the center of a revolutionary spectacle. Crowds gather outside the gates day and night. Loudspeakers broadcast speeches praising the students who seized the embassy. Revolutionary guards begin assisting the militants in securing the compound. Inside the embassy buildings, the hostages are separated and interrogated. Blindfolded Americans are led into rooms where young revolutionaries question them about CIA operations, diplomatic communications, and intelligence networks. The students carefully collect shredded documents that embassy staff had attempted to destroy during the takeover. Piece by piece, they begin reconstructing the papers. Soon, Iranian state media broadcasts the recovered fragments, claiming they reveal secret American plans to manipulate Iran's political future. The narrative spreads rapidly through the country. The embassy occupation becomes a symbol of defiance against the United States. Meanwhile, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini observes the situation from the holy city of Qom. The revolutionary leader understands the political power of the moment. Rather than condemning the takeover, he publicly endorses it. He calls the embassy seizure a righteous act against foreign domination and declares that the United States must answer for decades of interference in Iranian affairs. With that endorsement, the fate of the hostages becomes entangled with the revolutionary legitimacy of the Islamic Republic. Moderate Iranian leaders quickly lose control of the situation. Prime Minister Bazargan, who had only recently met with American officials in Algeria to discuss rebuilding relations, finds himself politically isolated. The revolutionary students now command the attention of the nation. Within days, Bazargan resigns. The provisional government collapses. Real power shifts decisively toward the revolutionary clerical leadership surrounding Khomeini. In Washington, this development deepens the crisis. Diplomatic communication channels that might have resolved the situation are rapidly disappearing. President Carter now faces an agonizing decision. He can attempt negotiations with a revolutionary movement that openly condemns the United States, or he can escalate pressure on Iran through economic and political measures. As the days pass, Carter chooses a cautious strategy. He hopes international diplomacy will secure the hostages' release. The United Nations becomes involved. Foreign governments quietly attempt to mediate. Messages pass indirectly between Washington and Tehran through diplomats in Europe and the Middle East. But inside Iran, the revolutionary atmosphere intensifies. Each day, the hostage crisis strengthens the political position of the most radical factions within the new Islamic Republic. Television broadcasts images of blindfolded American captives. Crowds chant outside the embassy gates. The crisis transforms from a diplomatic dispute into a national symbol of resistance. For many Iranians, the hostages represent the humiliation of a superpower that once dominated their country's politics. But for the United States, the crisis becomes a national trauma unfolding in slow motion. Every evening, American television networks lead with the same story: the embassy, the hostages, and the growing question of how long they will remain imprisoned. In living rooms across the United States, families watch the nightly reports with growing frustration. Newspapers print the number each day: day 5, day 10, day 20. What began as a shocking diplomatic incident is becoming something far more dangerous. A prolonged confrontation between a revolutionary state and the world's most powerful nation. And inside the White House, President Carter realizes that the longer the hostages remain captive, the greater the pressure will become. Soon patience will run out. And when that moment arrives, diplomacy alone may no longer be enough. To understand why the embassy takeover quickly became irreversible, you have to go back several weeks before November the 4th. October the 22nd, 1979. New York City. A quiet aircraft lands at a US Air Force base outside the city, carrying a man who had once ruled Iran for nearly 4 decades. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran. Only months earlier, he had fled Tehran as millions of demonstrators filled the streets demanding the end of his monarchy. Now he arrives in the United States seeking urgent medical treatment. The Shah is suffering from a serious form of cancer. Doctors at New York Hospital prepare to begin treatment for lymphoma, while American officials attempt to keep the arrival as discreet as possible. But secrecy proves impossible. News spreads quickly across Iran. For many Iranians who had just overthrown the Shah's government, the announcement feels like a betrayal. They believe Washington is preparing to restore its former ally to power. Memories of the 1953 coup suddenly feel dangerously relevant again. Back then, the United States had supported the Shah's return to the throne after the removal of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Now, revolutionary leaders fear history might repeat itself. Inside Tehran's universities, political discussions intensify. Student groups begin debating how to respond to what they see as an American provocation. Among the most determined are members of the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line. Their leaders include young activists such as Ebrahim Asgharzadeh and Mohsen Mirdamadi, who believe the revolution must defend itself against foreign interference. They begin planning a symbolic action. The idea initially seems simple: occupy the American embassy for a short time to protest the Shah's admission into the United States. Perhaps hold the compound for a few hours, demand that Washington return the former monarch to Iran to face trial for the repression and corruption of his regime. But once the students scale the embassy walls on November the 4th, the plan rapidly evolves beyond their expectations. The speed of events surprises even the organizers. Crowds outside the embassy grow larger each hour. Revolutionary Guards soon begin cooperating with the militants occupying the compound. And most importantly, Ayatollah Khomeini publicly endorses the takeover. With that statement, the temporary protest becomes a revolutionary cause. The student leaders quickly realize they now hold enormous political leverage. Inside the embassy, the hostages become bargaining chips in a much larger confrontation. The students issue their demand clearly. The United States must return the Shah to Iran. Only then will the hostages be released. In Washington, the demand is immediately rejected. President Jimmy Carter and his advisors understand that extraditing the Shah would set a dangerous precedent. It would also risk appearing as though the United States had abandoned a former ally under pressure. The decision locks both sides into a confrontation with no easy exit. Meanwhile, inside the embassy compound, the hostages begin adjusting to captivity. They are moved frequently between rooms to prevent rescue attempts. Some are held in solitary confinement. Others are forced to sit for hours while blindfolded. Occasionally, the militants bring them outside to pose for photographs or television broadcasts. The images travel around the world. Blindfolded diplomats, armed guards, a revolutionary crowd cheering outside the gates. For the United States, the humiliation becomes deeply personal. Families of the hostages gather in Washington seeking answers. Religious leaders organize prayer vigils. Members of Congress demand stronger action. The pressure on the Carter administration grows each day. At the same time, the crisis strengthens the revolutionary leadership in Tehran. Ayatollah Khomeini now frames the confrontation as a moral struggle between Islamic independence and Western domination. Mass demonstrations fill Tehran's streets supporting the embassy occupation. In speeches broadcast across the country, clerics praised the students for defending the revolution. Inside Iran's political system, the hostage crisis begins reshaping the balance of power. Moderate leaders who favored cooperation with the West disappear from the political stage. Radical factions aligned with Khomeini gain influence. The revolution is entering a new phase, and the American hostages remain trapped at the center of it. Back in Washington, officials begin exploring more serious responses: economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and quietly military options. But the situation grows more complicated with each passing week. Because the hostage crisis is no longer simply about the embassy. It has become a test of power between two nations whose relationship is collapsing in front of the world. November turns into December, and the crisis shows no sign of ending. Inside the White House, President Jimmy Carter and his advisors are now confronting a reality they had hoped to avoid. Diplomacy alone is failing. The Iranian students controlling the embassy have refused multiple appeals from international organizations, including the United Nations. Even quiet mediation efforts from governments such as Algeria and West Germany have produced no breakthrough. Every day, the hostages remain in captivity, weakens American credibility abroad, and intensifies political pressure at home. The Carter administration begins searching for ways to increase pressure on Iran, without immediately resorting to military action. One of the most powerful tools available is economic. On November 14, 1979, President Carter signs an executive order that dramatically escalates the confrontation. All Iranian government assets held in American banks are frozen. Billions of dollars belonging to Iran's central bank oil revenues and state institutions are suddenly locked inside the American financial system. The order shocks Tehran. Iran had relied heavily on international banking networks to manage its oil income and conduct global trade. With the stroke of a pen in Washington, a large portion of those funds becomes inaccessible. The freeze sends a message that the United States is prepared to use its economic influence as leverage. But the reaction inside Iran is defiant. Ayatollah Khomeini dismisses the sanctions as further evidence of American hostility. Revolutionary leaders argue that the asset freeze proves the United States had always intended to control Iran's economy. Mass rallies continue outside the embassy. Students display reconstructed embassy documents to journalists, claiming they reveal secret American plots inside Iran. Television broadcasts images of shredded cables that have been carefully taped back together. Iranian newspapers publish translated excerpts describing meetings between American diplomats and Iranian political figures during the final months of the Shah's government. To the revolutionary public, these revelations reinforce the belief that the embassy truly had been a center of foreign interference. The phrase, "den of spies," becomes a permanent label. Meanwhile, the hostage crisis begins reshaping international diplomacy. At the United Nations headquarters in New York, diplomats debate how to respond to the unprecedented seizure of an embassy. Under international law, diplomatic compounds are protected territory. The Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations is supposed to guarantee the safety of foreign diplomats. But in Tehran, those protections have collapsed. The UN Security Council passes resolutions calling for the immediate release of the hostages. Iran ignores them. Even many governments sympathetic to Iran's revolution are uneasy about the precedent being set. If embassies are no longer safe, the entire structure of diplomatic relations could be threatened. In Washington, the Carter administration also begins coordinating with allies to isolate Iran economically and politically. Oil markets watch closely. Iran had once been one of the world's largest petroleum exporters under the Shah. Now, the country's political turmoil is disrupting production and threatening global energy supplies. Financial markets begin reacting as well. Banks around the world examine their exposure to Iranian assets. The crisis that began at a single embassy compound is now spreading into the global financial system. But inside the White House, the most pressing concern remains the safety of the hostages. Intelligence reports suggest the captives are being held in multiple buildings inside the embassy compound. Some are reportedly chained to chairs at night to prevent escape attempts. Others are moved frequently between rooms. The uncertainty makes planning any rescue operation extremely difficult. Yet the idea of a military solution begins gaining attention among Carter's advisors. Pentagon planners quietly begin examining possible scenarios: special forces operations, airborne raids, covert infiltration, The problem is distance. Tehran lies deep inside Iranian territory, far from American military bases. Any rescue mission would require extraordinary coordination and precision. One mistake could cost the hostages their lives. President Carter remains cautious. He still hopes diplomacy can succeed. But as the weeks stretch into months, the pressure inside the United States grows almost unbearable. Each night on American television, a new number appears. Day 50, Day 60, Day 75. For millions of Americans watching from their living rooms, the question becomes unavoidable. If diplomacy fails, what will the United States do next? Inside the Pentagon and the Central Intelligence Agency, a secret answer is already beginning to take shape. A rescue mission unlike any in American military history. By early 1980, the hostage crisis has entered its 6th month. In Washington, patience is disappearing. President Jimmy Carter continues to face mounting political pressure. Congress demands action. Newspapers question whether the United States is losing its ability to protect its own diplomats. Families of the hostages appear regularly on television pleading for the government to bring their loved ones home. Inside the Pentagon, planning for a rescue operation has quietly advanced for weeks. The mission receives a name, Operation Eagle Claw. It will be one of the most complex special operations ever attempted by the United States military. The challenge is enormous. Tehran lies more than 1,000 kilometers from the nearest American bases capable of launching a rescue force. The operation must move through hostile airspace, land secretly inside Iran, travel across desert terrain, reach the embassy compound in the center of a heavily populated capital city, and extract dozens of hostages without triggering a massacre. To accomplish this, military planners designed a multi-stage plan. U.S. Navy helicopters will launch from the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz, positioned in the Arabian Sea. They will fly hundreds of miles across Iranian territory at night. At the same time, C-130 transport aircraft carrying Delta Force commandos will enter Iranian airspace from the south. Both groups will meet at a remote desert staging area deep inside Iran. The location receives a code name, Desert One. From there, helicopters will refuel and carry the commandos closer to Tehran. The rescue force will hide during the day at a second location near the capital. The following night, they will launch a coordinated assault on the embassy compound. Delta Force operators will storm the buildings, eliminate the guards, and extract the hostages. The helicopters will then carry everyone to a nearby Iranian air base, where additional aircraft will fly them out of the country. If successful, the operation could end the crisis in a single night. But the risks are staggering. The entire mission depends on precise timing, favorable weather, and mechanical reliability across thousands of miles of hostile territory. Even small problems could cascade into disaster. Yet by April 1980, President Carter concludes that waiting any longer is no longer politically or morally sustainable. He authorizes the mission. October 24th, 1980. Night falls across the Iranian desert. American aircraft begin entering Iranian airspace under radio silence. The first C-130 transports land at Desert One exactly as planned. Delta Force commandos quickly establish a security perimeter around the remote desert landing site. But problems begin appearing almost immediately. A powerful desert sandstorm known locally as a haboob sweeps across the region. The helicopters flying from the USS Nimitz struggle to navigate through thick clouds of dust and sand. Visibility drops dangerously low. One helicopter experiences mechanical failure and turns back toward the carrier. Another becomes lost in the storm. By the time the surviving helicopters reach Desert One, only 6 have arrived. The mission had required at least 6 operational helicopters to continue. Technically, the operation could still proceed. But then another problem emerges. One of the remaining helicopters is found to have a serious hydraulic malfunction. The number of usable helicopters drops to 5. The mission can no longer continue. Commanders on the ground relay the situation to Washington. Reluctantly, the order is given. Abort the operation. The commandos begin preparing to withdraw. But as the aircraft attempt to reposition for departure, tragedy strikes. In the darkness and confusion at Desert One, a helicopter collides with a C-130 refueling aircraft. The collision triggers a massive explosion. Fire erupts across the desert landing zone. 8 American servicemen are killed instantly. The surviving forces scramble to evacuate the area before Iranian patrols arrive. In the chaos of the retreat, several helicopters are abandoned in the desert. The rescue mission ends in disaster. Within hours, the world learns what has happened. Iranian television broadcasts images of the burned wreckage at Desert 1. For the revolutionary leadership in Tehran, the failed rescue attempt becomes propaganda proof of American aggression. For the United States, the failure is devastating. The hostages remain captive. 8 American soldiers are dead. And the credibility of the Carter administration has suffered a severe blow. But the crisis is still far from over. In fact, the political consequences of Operation Eagle Claw will soon ripple far beyond the deserts of Iran. They will reach all the way into the American presidential election later that year. In the United States, the news from the Iranian desert lands like a shockwave. April 25th, 1980. Television networks interrupt regular programming to deliver the announcement from the White House. President Jimmy Carter appears before the cameras and confirms what many Americans had already begun to suspect. A rescue mission had been attempted, and it had failed. 8 American servicemen are dead. The hostages remain in captivity. For Carter, the moment is deeply personal. Throughout the crisis, he had carried the burden of decision-making almost alone. Now he publicly accepts full responsibility for the failed mission. But the political damage is immediate. Across the country, the failed rescue becomes a symbol of national frustration. Newspapers publish photographs of the burned aircraft in the Iranian desert. Television commentators question whether American power has been diminished. The number that Americans have been watching for months continues to climb. Day 170, day 180, day 200. The hostage crisis has now become the dominant issue in American politics. And 1980 happens to be an election year. Republican candidate Ronald Reagan begins criticizing the Carter administration's handling of the crisis, arguing that American weakness has emboldened hostile governments around the world. Campaign rallies across the country echo with questions about national strength leadership and the protection of American citizens abroad. Inside, the Carter administration officials continue searching for diplomatic solutions. Despite the bitterness created by the failed rescue attempt, back-channel negotiations slowly begin emerging through intermediaries. One of the most important channels runs through Algeria. Algerian diplomats maintain communication with both Tehran and Washington, quietly attempting to build a framework for negotiations. But progress remains painfully slow. Inside Iran, the hostage crisis has become intertwined with the country's internal political transformation. In the summer of 1980, Iran formally adopts a new constitution establishing the Islamic Republic under the authority of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini as supreme leader. The political system is still stabilizing. Factional struggles continue between clerical leaders, revolutionary organizations, and emerging political parties. The hostages remain useful as a symbol of resistance against the United States. Releasing them too quickly could appear as a concession to American pressure. Meanwhile, a new and dangerous development begins unfolding on Iran's western border. September the 22nd, 1980. Iraqi forces under the leadership of President Saddam Hussein launch a full-scale invasion of Iran. The Iran-Iraq War has begun. The sudden outbreak of war dramatically changes Iran's strategic situation. The country now faces a massive military conflict along hundreds of kilometers of front lines. Economic resources are stretched. Military equipment is desperately needed. Under these new conditions, Iranian leaders begin reassessing the value of continuing the hostage standoff. The crisis with the United States still carries symbolic power. But Iran now faces a much more immediate threat from Iraq. Behind closed doors, Iranian officials begin discussing the possibility of negotiations that might unlock frozen financial assets and reduce international pressure. At the same time, the American presidential campaign continues accelerating. As November approaches, Ronald Reagan steadily gains momentum in the polls. Many voters associate the ongoing hostage crisis with a perception of American weakness on the global stage. Every passing day with the hostages still imprisoned becomes a political liability for Carter. The crisis that began with a crowd climbing the walls of the US Embassy in Tehran has now become entangled with a presidential election in the United States. And with the outbreak of war in the Middle East, the strategic calculations inside Tehran are beginning to shift as well. For the first time in nearly a year, the possibility of a negotiated resolution begins to emerge. But even that solution will arrive only after one final political twist, a moment that will forever link the end of the hostage crisis with the transfer of power in Washington. As the Iran-Iraq war intensifies in late 1980, the calculations inside Tehran begin to change. Iran now faces a massive conventional war along its western border. Iraqi armored divisions push across the frontier while artillery bombardments strike Iranian cities. The revolutionary government that had spent months focused on ideological struggle with the United States suddenly finds itself fighting for national survival. Military supplies are urgently needed, financial resources are becoming strained, and billions of dollars in Iranian assets remain frozen inside American banks. Quietly, Iranian leaders begin reconsidering the hostage crisis. For more than a year, the captives had served as a powerful symbol of resistance against the United States. But now the war with Iraq is consuming Iran's attention and resources. A prolonged standoff with Washington no longer offers the same strategic advantages. At the same time, diplomats in several countries continue searching for ways to break the deadlock. Among them, Algerian officials play a crucial role. Algeria had maintained relatively neutral relations with both the United States and revolutionary Iran. Because of that position, Algerian diplomats become trusted intermediaries capable of passing messages between the two governments. Throughout late 1980, negotiations quietly begin taking shape through these back channels. In Washington, the Carter administration outlined several key conditions. First, the immediate and safe release of all American hostages. Second, assurances that the United States will not interfere in Iran's internal political affairs. And third, the settlement of financial claims between the two countries. Tehran presents its own demands. Iran wants access to its frozen assets. It also wants guarantees that the United States will not attempt to punish the Islamic Republic economically or politically after the hostages are released. The negotiations move slowly. Months of anger, mistrust, and humiliation weigh heavily on both sides. But the war with Iraq continues pressing Iran toward compromise. At the same time, the American political calendar is moving toward a decisive moment. November 4th, 1980. Exactly 1 year after the embassy takeover, Americans go to the polls. The result is clear. Ronald Reagan defeats Jimmy Carter in a landslide victory. For Carter, the defeat carries a bitter irony. The hostage crisis that had dominated his presidency has also played a central role in his political downfall. Yet even after the election, Carter continues working intensely during the final weeks of his presidency to secure the hostages' freedom. Negotiations through Algerian intermediaries accelerate in December and January. Legal experts from both sides begin drafting a complex agreement that will resolve the financial disputes between the two countries. The arrangement eventually becomes known as the Algiers Accords. Under the terms being discussed, the United States will release billions of dollars in frozen Iranian assets. Iran will agree to free all American hostages and resolve outstanding financial claims through an international arbitration tribunal. The framework slowly comes together, but inside Tehran, the timing of the release becomes politically sensitive. Iranian leaders understand the symbolic power of the moment. If the hostages are freed while Jimmy Carter is still president, it could appear as though the United States forced Iran into submission. But if the release occurs after Ronald Reagan takes office, the revolutionary leadership can claim it resisted American pressure until the very end. The final timing begins to matter almost as much as the agreement itself. In Washington, Carter and his advisors continue negotiating despite knowing that another president will soon take office. For Carter, the mission has become personal. After more than 14 months of captivity, the priority is no longer political advantage. The priority is bringing the hostages home alive. And as January 1981 approaches, the final pieces of the agreement begin falling into place. Soon the world will witness one of the most remarkable diplomatic moments of the Cold War era. A crisis that lasted 444 days is about to reach its conclusion. But the final chapter will unfold with dramatic precision, timed almost exactly to the minute. January 19th, 1981. In Algiers, diplomats from the United States and Iran finalize the documents that will end one of the longest hostage crises in modern diplomatic history. After weeks of intense negotiations, the Algiers Accords are officially signed. The agreement outlines the conditions that will finally break the deadlock. The United States will unfreeze billions of dollars in Iranian assets that had been locked in American banks since November 1979. The funds will be transferred through international financial institutions and placed into accounts controlled by Iran. At the same time, a special tribunal will be created to resolve legal claims between the two countries. In exchange, Iran agrees to release the 52 American hostages who have spent more than 14 months in captivity. For the hostages inside Tehran, the news arrives cautiously. Many of them have experienced repeated rumors of release over the past year. Several times, their captors had suggested negotiations were nearing completion, only for the talks to collapse again. But this time, something feels different. Preparations begin inside the embassy compound. The prisoners are told to gather their belongings. Some are given new clothing. Others are photographed one last time by Iranian television crews. Outside the compound, revolutionary guards quietly prepare transportation. Meanwhile, across the world in Washington, the final hours of the Carter presidency are unfolding. January 20th, 1981. Morning arrives in the American capital under a cold winter sky. Inside the United States Capitol building, thousands of guests gather for the inauguration ceremony of Ronald Reagan as the 40th President of the United States. Jimmy Carter sits among them. His presidency is ending, yet his attention remains fixed on Tehran. For days, American negotiators have monitored the final implementation of the agreement. Financial transfers are being processed through international banks. Diplomatic messages move back and forth between Washington, Algiers, and Tehran. Everything must be completed before the hostages can leave Iran. Inside the embassy compound in Tehran, the captives wait. Some have spent months in solitary confinement. Others endured psychological pressure and repeated interrogations. Now they are told they will soon be leaving the country. But even at this moment, uncertainty remains. The revolutionary authorities have carefully chosen the timing of the release. They want the departure of the hostages to coincide almost exactly with the transfer of presidential power in the United States. Shortly after noon in Washington, Ronald Reagan stands before the Capitol and raises his right hand. Chief Justice Warren Burger administers the oath of office. Ronald Reagan officially becomes President of the United States. At almost the same moment, events begin moving quickly inside Tehran. Buses carrying the American hostages depart from the former embassy compound. The vehicles travel through Tehran's streets under heavy guard as crowds gather along the roads watching the unusual convoy. For many Iranians, the crisis that had dominated their country's relationship with the United States for more than a year is finally coming to an end. The buses reach Mehrabad Airport on the western edge of the city. Waiting on the runway is an Algerian aircraft that will carry the hostages out of Iran. As the Americans board the plane, Iranian officials complete the final paperwork, confirming the financial transfers agreed upon in the Algiers Accords. Minutes later, the aircraft begins taxiing toward the runway. At 12:33 p.m. Washington time, just 20 minutes after Ronald Reagan has taken the oath of office, the plane lifts off from Tehran. For the first time in 444 days, the American hostages are no longer prisoners. They are finally on their way home. As the Algerian aircraft climbs into the winter sky above Tehran, a quiet realization spreads through the cabin. For 444 days, the men and women on board had lived inside a diplomatic compound that had turned into a prison. Now the city that held them captive begins disappearing beneath the clouds. Some of the former hostages sit silently in their seats, exhausted by the emotional weight of the moment. Others begin cautiously talking to one another, still adjusting to the sudden shift from captivity to freedom. For many, the experience feels almost unreal. The aircraft heads first toward Algeria, the country whose diplomats had quietly helped broker the agreement that made the release possible. At Houari Boumediene Airport in Algiers, the plane lands to refuel and allow medical teams to examine the passengers. Doctors move quickly through the cabin, checking vital signs and assessing the physical condition of the hostages. Many appear thinner than when they had arrived in Tehran more than a year earlier. Several show signs of stress and exhaustion, but remarkably, most are physically stable. For the first time in more than 14 months, they are able to speak freely with American officials. Shortly afterward, another aircraft arrives to carry them the rest of the way home. The next destination is a US military hospital in Wiesbaden, West Germany, where medical teams and psychological specialists are already preparing for their arrival. Back in the United States, the news spreads rapidly. Television networks interrupt their inauguration coverage with breaking reports. The hostages have been released. Across the country, church bells ring. Crowds gather in city centers. In many places, people embrace strangers in spontaneous celebrations. For months, Americans had followed the crisis through nightly broadcasts that counted the days of captivity. Now the number finally stops. Day 444. At the White House, Ronald Reagan receives confirmation that the aircraft carrying the former hostages has left Iranian airspace. Although the negotiations that secured their freedom had been completed during Jimmy Carter's final days in office, the release itself now coincides with the beginning of Reagan's presidency. The symbolism is impossible to ignore. For Carter, the moment brings a complicated mixture of relief and reflection. Only hours after leaving the presidency, he boards a plane bound for West Germany, where he will personally greet the returning Americans. When the aircraft carrying the hostages finally lands at the US military hospital in Wiesbaden, the reunion becomes one of the most emotional scenes of the entire crisis. Doctors, military personnel, and diplomats line the runway. As the passengers step off the aircraft, many appear overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Television cameras capture the moment as Carter walks forward to greet them. For more than a year, he had carried the responsibility for their safety. Now he shakes their hands one by one. Some of the hostages embrace him. Others simply thank him quietly. The long ordeal is finally over. Yet even as the celebrations unfold, the deeper consequences of the crisis are already becoming clear. The relationship between the United States and Iran has been permanently transformed. Diplomatic ties between the two countries have collapsed. Mutual distrust now dominates their political relationship. The embassy compound in Tehran will never again operate as an American diplomatic mission. Instead, it will remain a powerful symbol of the revolution that reshaped Iran and the confrontation that followed. But the story of the hostage crisis does not end with the hostages' return. Its impact will continue shaping global politics for decades. In the years that followed, the Iranian hostage crisis became far more than a dramatic episode in diplomatic history. It became a defining turning point in the relationship between the United States and Iran. Before 1979, the two countries had been close strategic partners. Washington had supported the government of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi for decades, supplying military equipment, economic assistance, and intelligence cooperation. American companies invested heavily in Iran's oil industry. Iranian officers trained alongside American forces. Tehran was often described by US officials as a pillar of stability in the Middle East. But the revolution of 1979 shattered that relationship, and the seizure of the American embassy ensured that it would not be repaired anytime soon. After the hostages were released, diplomatic relations between the two countries remained frozen. The United States closed its embassy in Tehran permanently, and Iran severed official ties with Washington. For decades afterward, Switzerland would serve as the protecting power representing American interests inside Iran. The embassy compound itself remained under Iranian control. Within the walls where diplomats once worked, revolutionary murals appeared. Anti-American slogans covered the outer barriers. The building that had once symbolized diplomatic engagement was transformed into a monument to revolutionary resistance. Inside the United States, the crisis also left a deep political legacy. The failure of Operation Eagle Claw exposed serious weaknesses in how the American military coordinated complex special operations. In the years that followed, the Pentagon reorganized its command structures to improve joint operations between different branches of the armed forces. One result of those reforms would eventually be the creation of United States Special Operations Command, designed to coordinate elite military units capable of conducting precisely the kind of mission that had failed in the Iranian desert. The crisis also reshaped American foreign policy thinking. Future administrations became far more cautious about the security of diplomatic missions overseas. Embassies were redesigned with stronger defensive structures, improved evacuation plans, and more robust intelligence monitoring. But perhaps the most enduring consequence was psychological. For many Americans, the images of blindfolded diplomats and angry crowds outside the embassy gates became a lasting symbol of vulnerability and humiliation. For many Iranians, the same images represented the moment their revolution defied a global superpower. Two very different narratives emerged from the same event, and those competing memories would influence political attitudes for generations. Even decades later, the mistrust that grew during those 444 days continues shaping the policies of both nations. Sanctions. Nuclear negotiations, regional conflicts, and diplomatic standoffs all carry echoes of the moment when militants climbed the walls of the US Embassy in Tehran. November the 4th, 1979 had begun as a protest by a group of students who feared foreign interference in their revolution. But the consequences of that day extended far beyond the embassy compound. They reshaped global diplomacy. They altered the course of American politics. And they permanently transformed one of the most important geopolitical relationships in the modern Middle East. The crisis lasted 444 days, but its shadow has lasted far longer. And